Here we are at the very end of the 20th century. Argumentatively, it was the greatest century in humankind. Maybe the people in the future will disagree. But in any case, many of us, we are all very knowledgeable of this time. And it's a good moment to reflect on the departure of a time that we have all shared and all know. We have always talked about this is the 19s, 19 whatever, or whatever decade we're in and whatever year we're in. From this point on, it will always be the 20s for all of us. And this, as I say, was probably the greatest decade. But with it came some of the greatest discoveries. To think that 100 years ago, men did not fly. No one watched TV. No one listened to radios. Telephone, electric light was about the only high-tech thing a century ago. And now we have sound motion pictures and television and handheld communications and men going to the moon, as well as ordinary people going anywhere on the planet within a day, thanks to the advent of aviation that happened in this decade. But also in this decade, this century, has come some of the worst things in humankind. We have seen social movements such as communism, which ideally would be the ideals of man, but seen it so horribly perverted by man. We have seen racism elevated to the level of monstrous, murderous behavior by a government in Germany. And it's important for the next century to realize that with this technology, we must learn the dangers of our time, as well as the good. We end this century kind of like a whimper rather than a bang. But 30 years ago, 35 years ago, the chance that the entire planet would go up in a bang was very real. So it is good now that we end it this way, in this mild, happy time. But we have to understand exactly the dangers and the good of our time. By reflecting on all the times that have transpired in this century, maybe it will help the people, us, who have lived in this century, and will live out our lives in the remainder of the next century, and help the generation to come to understand the difficulties and challenges of this new century. So before we go into this new century, let us reflect on the century that is now departed.
Now, Mr. Malinowski, I'd like you to think back to the earliest thing you can remember.
Remember what?
How old were you when it was going on?
What was going on? All I remember, World War I, when I told you where I lived on Chapin Street by the Holy Trinity on Noble and off of Division, south of Division. I know a bunch of young soldiers were all lined up with civilian, and they're ready to be drafted into the World War I. And they were getting blessed by the bishop of the church. That I recall.
What else do you remember about the time before you went to school?
I'll never forget this as long as I live. They had Kaiser posters on them, and the kids in the alley put it on the post, and they were throwing rocks at the Kaiser. And I was a kid, so I was born 1914, and the World War broke out. So I must have been about 4 or 5 years old too, just about. and I'll never forget that. As long as I live, a kid come up to me, he says, "Whose side you on? The Kaiser or the Americans?" And I said, "The Kaiser." And he was going to beat me up, and the guy said, "Wait a minute. What do you expect of a little kid to know the difference between a Kaiser and an American? Never forget that. In reality, truth, they kept throwing stones against the Kaiser. They put the Kaiser's picture on the post, they kept throwing. And a little bigger kid was going to beat me up because I said, I'm a Kaiser.
Where did you live when you were little, and what did your house look like?
I'll tell you, John, in them days, people, they believe in hoarding money in a bank. They live, I'll never forget it. All they had was a bed, a table, chairs, and if they had excess, they were living on benches and orange crates, apple crates. That was referring, and newspapers was Polish, they call it, and today they call it a Polish rugs. That's all the people believe in, scribbling there and putting newspapers. They didn't have any furniture to talk about. All they were, people were interested in make money and put it in the bank. And that's what started the Big Depression. Everybody was putting money in the bank and nothing, buying nothing.
Did you go to Cafe as a young child?
Oh yes, I had a lot of them. And in them days, believe me, everybody had a big family. You can have baseball in that one block. You can have 4 teams. On the average, people used to have 7 to 15 kids. You wouldn't believe it, and that's it. There was nothing but girls and boys. In summer, I tell you, good thing they didn't have many cars. They had horses, and that street was always packed with kids playing baseball, and girls were playing what they call jacks and skipping the rope. That I remember. But the street was always crowded with girls and boys.
What would you say about your relationship with your parents?
Oh, I'd say pretty good. I can never complain. That's one thing. The old timers were very strict. The girls would be pulled in just when they'd be called. Even in summer, they'd call them in. As soon as it gets dark, between 7:30 and 8, the girls go in, and about 8:30 or 9, the boys had to go off the street. By 10 o'clock, you wouldn't see one boy out in the street or a girl. They'd all be home doing their homework or sleep in the summer. Summer, then only winter they do their homework. Now, their parents were very strict.
What social group did you belong to, and what kind of kids did you associate with?
When you were a teenager.
Teenager, I associate with most of them were of Polish descent. There's a few Italians, a few Germans, most were Polish. And they were all sport-minded like I was. Swimming, baseball, handball, ice skating, roller skating, and so forth. And we kept it up till I graduated from Catholic school, and I got my brother Stanley's birth certificate, and that was my first job. I was only 14, and I went under his name 16. He's 2 years older. And my first job was not under my name, Walter. It was under Stanley. Otherwise, they wouldn't take me. You had to be 16 years old. That's how I got my first job, with his birth certificate.
Favorite sport, and were you in any teams?
I was in baseball quite a bit. We were known as, we used to play ball for money. We'd scrape up the money and we'd play in Lincoln Park. We'd play a game for 50 or 100, and we had to pay $5 for the umpires each. We put 5, the other team put 5. And then you had to pay $5 for the diamond. We'd always play on a Saturday or Sunday. You got to schedule it. And we were, what was our name? Trying to think, gee, now I can't, lost track of that name. But we used to always play for money. And I'll never forget the time we played a colored team. They had a beanball pitcher, and believe me, What a fastball he was. He was a 6'6". He was a bean. He was slim as a bean, and he had the fastest ball I ever saw. And I went up to bat the first time. I'll never forget it. That ball whizzed past me. I never even took my bat off my shoulder. I said, "Man, this guy got smoke on that ball." He struck me out. I struck out twice. And very seldom I didn't strike out, and he really had a ball. The third time I come up and bat, I says, I can't, I don't have that bat to swing in time. I said, I'm just stick it out like I'm gonna bunt it, and I got a single off him. We beat him, 1-0 with my single, and a guy hit me in with a triple. It was that was the fastest colored guy ever I faced. I could strike any man on it. Even everybody complained. He said, that guy really had something on the ball. He'd wind up, and the next thing you know, the ball would be in the catcher's mitt. You was surprised how fast he can throw that ball. And he was a good pitcher. Whoever he was, he'd be a good pitcher if they'd let the colors play. They didn't. But like I say, my stepfather was lacking work always. You know, during the Depression, he maybe worked 1 day a week, maybe he worked 2 days a month, and it was hard until he died in 1930. And then it was hard for my mother, and I figured, well, I'd help her out, and by going, you know, in a CC and giving that $25 for her and $5 we kept for ourselves. Stanley and I, we'd both join, my oldest brother and I. That gives her $50 a month, and we kept 5 for ourselves. See, 25 was sent home, to direct home, and we kept 5 for ours when we were in the CC. We both went to Idaho, and that's when I was 22 years old in 1934, when Roosevelt was the president. I told you, John, I had jobs on and off. The only job I had in Grisby and Groner, I loved that job. But like anything else, they start cutting down because, you know what I mean, the warehouses was loaded with radios and nobody was buying them, and I got laid off. I got laid off when I was about, let's see, I think about 18 or 19. But jobs were scarce. I tried in so many places. I maybe worked 2-3 weeks for $12, $15. I went to Goldblatt's. I worked for Goldblatt's too. $15 a week. People don't know how tough it was jobs. I remember the girls in the dime store, they didn't get no wages. They only got commission. Commission between what they sold. Now on the average, they made $1.75 to $2.10 or $2.25 a week. They had to work Thursday to 9 o'clock to 9:30, and Saturday to 9:30. And I worked on a truck, furniture truck, light delivery, and they had union drivers. They went and dropped me off at the warehouse Thursday and Saturday. Saturday didn't work. I had to go to the warehouse. I worked Saturday, all day Saturday to 9:30 for $15 a week. And talk about...
What impact, if any, did the Depression have on your life or your family?
The Depression had a big impact on our life. I can remember before my father got killed that the city of Chicago couldn't pay any of their help, their teachers, their policemen. So my dad would go once a week out to farmers and work in the farms, and then bring back maybe a sack of potatoes, a sack of green beans, some corn sometimes. And to this day, I hate beets, because my mother used to make red beets almost every which way, and the one thing that she did make from the potatoes he grew out was French fries, and I've never been able to make them as good as hers. I remember 1928, because my dad got his first car, and that was a Model T Ford, and we kids would sit in there, and he'd have to get out and crank the car to make it go. And in 1930, about 3 months before he got killed, he bought his second car, which was a Model A, and that was also a crank, but it was a little bit more modern than the Model T. Not much about the late 20s, but in the 30s, I remember, first off, my father got killed on July 18, 1930. He was a fireman. He fell off a roof, 5 floors, and of course it killed him. And in 1932, we elected the best president we ever had in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and everybody loved him because they were so poor, people didn't even have food on their table, and when he got in, he did everything he could so that the poor people at least could have something to eat. And in 1933, Chicago had a Chicago World's Fair, and we had Sally Rand, who used to do it was all feathers, and she never had any clothes on. She'd have a big feather in the back and a big feather in the front, and she would do her dance. And she was really well famous in that. And in 1935, I met...
Anything of the 20s? Do you remember anything of the 20s?
Well, very little. There was
What do you
tough
remember?
years there. I mean, lots of snow. Mostly traveling was by horse.
Yeah,
Team
horse.
horses at that time yet. I mean, cars and tractors were just starting.
Okay.
Started school at Loveland Corners out there. And I had neighbors took turns hooking up a cutter and bring us to school one day, and the next day would be my dad's turn. And it was back in the old days, I guess. Went through the 30s there. Yeah. Depression,
Yep.
hot weather. That's some of the heat records that we're trying to break today came from in the 30s, 34, 35. But they were tough years, but I guess we all made it.
Stay here.
Yep.
Stay here.
What was your anything else happen in the 30s? When you came?
Well, yeah, the first thing I really remember is going to the World's Fair. And I don't remember what year. It was either 1933 or 34. And I remember Royal Coaster Wagons had a statue of a kid in a coaster wagon with one leg in the coaster wagon and the other one like he was pushing it. And then they had, at that time it was Sinclair, they had dinosaurs, the models of dinosaurs, and that I remember. And I remember going on the one ride, I don't remember what it was called, but you went up a tower and then you slid down a tube and you came out on a pad at the bottom. I remember that. Too much else I don't remember too much about, but that I do remember. Back in the 30s, you didn't have money for much of anything, so whatever money you could make, I remember, I forget how old I was, I delivered circulars for a local, like, small department store. Got 25 cents for the whole batch of circulars we had to deliver. So that's basically the most I remember then, is about, well, the Hitler on the radio. I know this friend of mine, his father, thought Hitler was wonderful. And he used to listen to the radio and hear his speeches.
Why did he think he was wonderful?
I don't know. He thought he was a nice guy, and I didn't think so. I remember that.
I guess the world made that judgment too.
Yeah.
For the 40s, what do you remember was going on in your family in the 40s?
Well, let's see. I remember when the war started and Germany invaded Poland.
Kind of in the end of the 30s, okay.
That was 39, and then when England got it into the war in 39, and then when France fell in May of, was it May? Yeah, I think it was May of 1940. And that, I remember the newsreel that showed the Germans marching into Paris and showed this one Frenchman standing there crying. That was Yeah, that was in 1940. And you hear about, at 11 years old, I wasn't paying that much attention to everything that was going on. But I remember all the battles when the English and the French were fighting Germans. And then I remember towards the end of 40, I forget what it was now. Not everything you can remember, but I remember when, what I really remember was from 41, the end of 41, because that's when, I remember I went to the show at the Oak Theater on Western and Armitage, and that's no longer there now, I understand. I went into the show, and I come home, and everybody's saying, geez, that's terrible. I said, what? And they said that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And then I remember Uncle Roy went in February. He joined the Army, him and his friend Jack Van Camp. And then they went down, they first went to Camp Grant, which was in western Illinois. And then he went from there down to Florida for his training. And then he took some training up near Massachusetts. And then I remember him coming home on leave, and then he went back in, and then he got shipped overseas, and that was in 42 when he didn't get into the invasion of North Africa. He got there after it ended towards the end of 42 or early 43, and then he stayed there till they were training. His division didn't get into Sicily. They were still training in North Africa, and then they got in the invasion in Italy at Salerno, which is south of Naples. And then I remember he got wounded. About 3 weeks after they landed. Him and an officer he was in a machine gun crew, and him and his officer were spotting from a farmhouse for the machine guns, and the Germans figured it was being used for spotting, so they opened fire on it, and the officer got pretty badly wounded. He lost an arm, I guess, and an eye, and Uncle Roy only got hit with shrapnel, but he got right in the forehead. He got hit with the shrapnel. And he stayed over there for all of 43 and the early part of 44. And then he had got on a boat to come, and the boat never got out of the harbor of Naples. It hit a mine, and so they had to get off that boat, and then he finally came home. He said it took him 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic because they kept zigzagging to cross the Atlantic. And then he came home, and he came home on leave. And that time he came home in 44, I was working for Pepsi-Cola.
Yes, that happened to you in the 40s.
Oh, in the 40s? Well, when the war ended in Germany, I remember I went downtown, and there was a madhouse. There was crazy people down there, and that was pretty exciting. And then I was when I was in school, and I remember when in 44 when the invasion was, I was in what was it? Machine drawing in high school, and the teacher, they put on the loudspeakers about the landing in Normandy, and that's all we did. We sat there and listened to it. We didn't do any more work. And then 46, I started.
So you alluded to a lot of what was going on in the world in the 40s. Is there anything else you want to say about what was going on in the world that you haven't already said?
Trying to remember. Oh, I remember all the bond drives when City of Chicago they had a cruiser that was sunk, and it was this cruiser Chicago, and they had to raise, I forget how many millions, they wanted to pay for a new one. And
when World War II broke out. In December 7, 1941, Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor. And next day, President Roosevelt declared war. He asked Congress, give him the power to declare war on Japan. And then he declared on Japan, then in Germany. That's when we entered December 8th. Japan, we declared war on Japan, and December 8th, the same time we declared war against Germany. And that was 1941. That's when everybody wanted to get into war, even I'm included. Even I was married with 3 kids.
And what did you do?
Well, I was talked out by my brother Stanley, he was the oldest, and then my brother Ed, he's younger than me. Then my half-brother Steve, he was in the Air Force as a sergeant. And he says, you're nuts to get in the Army. There's 3 of us, and you got 3 kids. Where is your brains? And he told me, stay out of it. 3 is enough. And I stayed. And next thing I know, I was called in front of the board. And before they had you, what you call draft board, and they asked me what my intention to do, get in the Army or to stay. And I told them I'm staying because I got 3 brothers, and I told them who they were, and they looked at me and said, that's right, you have. They had all the records down. They knew they knew when you're lying or not. And they said, well, we want you to get, what are you doing now? I work for Flashing Neon. And they told me, you cannot work for a non-productive, you gotta get in defense plant. He says, there's 2 plants you can go to. He says, the first one, he says, Buick was making airplane motors. And that was I can't think, it was out in the country. No, we had no car, only my friend, he always had old jalopies. And the newest one was Bendix, that was on Chicago Avenue in Sacramento. They were making carburetors. So I choose, instead of going out in the country with an old car, we were better off to ride a streetcar, and it's 7 cents. So we went and got a job in the defense plant, Bendix Aviation, making carburetors for the airplanes. And at the same time, my wife got a job there before I did. She got in called, and she went to school in Lane Tech to study to be inspector. She went to a 6 weeks training school in Lane Tech High School, and they taught her how to read gauges of all kinds and gauge the carburetors. So she got hired 3 months before I did. She worked 3 months, and then I joined her. They put me in the airbox, and being the maintenance man of the airbox where they test carburetors. But the money, you could work all the hours you wanted to make money, and money was to be had. They were paying good. I got $1.25 an hour, and that was good money. I can't complain. Only they told us this was a war plant, and as soon as the war is over, he says, you're out of a job. So that was it. We got laid off in May of 1945, because they made that. When did they made that invasion? In June or May?
Did World War II have any personal tragedy?
Yes, my half-brother Steve, he was a sergeant in the Air Force, and he was going across invasion of Sicily. And as they were going across, I met a sailor. He told me all about my brother's ship. He was the first one to hit. He says when they went in, the wolf packs were waiting for them. He said we were sitting ducks. He says every U-boat was waiting for every American ship that come in. He says they shot them as fast as they come up to him, and all the U-boats were waiting. And he said his ship was hit first. And the Army and Air Force were locked in their what do you call them doors, and Navy takes the top. And by the time, he got hit, he went down less than 3 minutes. He says, that's the way they did. He said, if you was on that ship, he says, you was not a Navy man. Only Navy men were allowed to be on deck. But all Army, all Army and aviation were all locked up in their rooms, and they call them, sealed in case if they were torpedoed by one, they could lock a room and save the other ship. But he says they were hit so bad, the ship went down in less than 3 minutes. He says I had a couple of buddies of mine was on that ship where your brother was, and he says when that ship was hit, it went so down in less than 3 minutes. He says none of my two buddies got saved. He said they went down with the ship. He says it got hit pretty bad. He says your brother was locked in. He said they'd never get him out. He's in deep water. He says because we even wrote to the Navy and they told him no way we could bring his body up. He says it's such deep water. He says they couldn't send a diver down without risking his life.
What impact, if any, did World War II have on your life?
Well, we didn't have a lot of things. You couldn't buy foods, like coffee. You had a ration coupon. They rationed everything. And if you bought meat, you got just so much meat. You got just so much coffee. And you didn't get enough oil. And we used to have oil to heat our homes. We didn't get enough of that. Everything was rationed. That is the biggest effect. You had to learn to make meals with no meat and a lot of things like that. It was very difficult.
When did you leave home?
So then the 40s went by. My husband's brother got killed in the Army, and he got killed in 1944, the same year that Jimmy died. And the 40s went by very fast. We were living, but we were in the war, because the war started in 1941 on December the 7th when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. I remember that very clear because the very next day I was working at Stewart and Warner's, and we were in like a war plant, and they were telling us that the president was going to speak and we had to go into the lunchroom, and that's when he declared war on Japan and he declared war on Germany, and that was when the United States got into the war. Now, the war went on until 1945, and President Roosevelt, he was president twice, and he was going in for his third term, but his health was bad and he died. And the day that he died was terrible because
fourth term, sorry.
What?
Just a historical correction. It was the fourth term. Go ahead.
Fourth term. Yeah, it wasn't a third.
He was elected
fourth.
he went through 3 terms.
But he was ill and he shouldn't have gone because he died in, I think it was April of 1944. 45, just before the end of the war. But he was really the reason the war got over. But Truman got the credit for it. But then 1940s went by and it
Take care of the 30s.
Yeah.
So going back to the decade of the 40s, what do you remember was going on in your family in the 40s?
Well, the 40s was wartime for us, and a lot of my uncles and that were in the war. And I remember I couldn't write, but I used to scribble letters to my uncles and send it to them. At least I think my mother sent it to them. And even though I was young, I still remember it being a big worry. And I remember the blackout time, and what do they call that when they had air raids practice and all that stuff. And war was a big thing for me in the 40s, not only to me to realize that there was a war, but also the ending of the war. And President Roosevelt's death was a very big thing in there. That that came to pass then. So I remember running around the neighborhood telling the neighbors because we had heard it on the radio.
What was the? Oh, you done?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
that's all right. That's all right.
What was the happiest thing in the 40s?
The happiest thing in the 40s was my uncles all coming home safely from the war. And, well, I don't know, we had chicken coops and...
Decade of the 40s, what was going on? What do you remember was going on in your family in the 40s?
Well, in the 40s, of course, the war was going to start, and I remember all the families, our relatives were afraid of the draft coming. What would it do to the families if the men had to go to war? I remember sitting around a table. That was almost a nightly conversation in those days, as well as weekend get-togethers with other family members. And that was a concern, and we talked about it at school. I believe I was just about 7 years old when the war broke out, and I still can remember listening to President Roosevelt's infamous speech about after Pearl Harbor attack. It was something that, a memory that you'll never forget. And I think it changed all of us. We as young children, as well as the adults, the whole world changed.
What was your happiest memory of the 40s?
The 40s? Well, of course, the end of the war. And big celebrations. Having everybody come back to their families, mainly the men. And I could see that people in general were beginning to be happy again. Not only in our own neighborhoods, in our schools, but throughout other countries as we would see newsreels when we go to the movie theater. So I think that was pretty much happy times at that particular time in the 40s.
You alluded to some world events.
Other than as a result of the war, maybe that's what I was alluding to.
Oh.
Because of the torturing that went on in some of the countries that, Germany had overpowered, and as well as Japan. I remember when we were in school, I went to Catholic school, and the nuns would always, at least once a month, talk about some of the priests and nuns that were taken prisoner throughout Europe. And that was always something that we knew was what was taking place, that was, tortured or very unhappy times for a lot of people as a result of the war. But that's I'm proud.
Got or died, one of the two.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because I can remember as a young kid when Arthur Godfrey was announcing it, and he was on like a side of a building, and he had the radio on, and we were listening to that.
Anything else in the world that you remember in the 40s?
Just to backtrack a decade, do you remember the World War II?
No, I do remember though in the 40s when I was a little girl, before I went to school. In school, see, there was ration stamps, even after the war. Or that must have been during the war yet. See, I don't remember. I think, yeah, that must have been. And my mother making me walk to the park and getting milk, because they had a special program for children that weren't in school, because the other children got milk in school. And I hated it because the milk was warm, and I hated warm milk.
Till May of '43. Of course, I was drafted in World War II. Spent 3 years in the service, 2 years in the South Pacific. Came back in this area in 1946.
In the South Pacific?
I was there in 44 and 45, yeah. During 32nd Division, Company D. Went all the way through New Guinea, Philippines, and into Japan. Landed in Japan about 2 days after the signing of the peace treaty. Hirohito had tried to commit suicide, or made it look that way, and I and a guy from Chicago took care of him for a couple, 3 days till they took him out of there. In fact, they signed, when he signed that peace treaty, I was in the room when he signed it. It was signed on a ship out on the ocean, and then it was brought in there, and he put his final signature on. I and the kid from Chicago was a witness to that signature.
Wow.
And I have a copy of that, and it's in the Veterans Center right down here in Rice Lake right now. You can go down and see it if you want to.
And you were the
I took it down there. It's kind of turned yellow now. It just got folded up here, and then when we started this new Veterans Center, they were looking for stuff to put in there, you know, for keepsake or something, and I thought, well, it don't really mean nothing to anybody else, and then I hadn't really taken care of it either. I took it down there, and now it's in it's on the wall in a big frame, and
Wow, that's
so,
something to remember.
So you're like the military escort for Emperor Hirohito?
well, I was a medical technician in the service, and took care of him in the hospital when 12 hours on. I was just trying to think of the guy's name that was in Chicago. So, I mean, we had to feed him, shave him. We wouldn't, you know, we couldn't let him have anything that he might try to commit suicide again, which I don't think he ever would, because when he did commit suicide or tried that, he just stabbed himself in the side here a little bit. So, I came back in '46 and got married in '46.
What would you say you remember was going on in the 40s?
40s?
In the world?
Well, the world was a very disturbed world at that time. I had that German airlift. It was almost called back because we stayed in the reserves. Well, you know, we had lost our president there, and that was in '45. I was still in the Philippines when he died. That was probably the big thing right there in the '40s, I'd say, when Roosevelt died.
And of course the war that you participated in.
War, and then we got that peace treaty or deal there, that signed that deal there. And to us, I suppose the biggest thing that happened was the 3rd of September. For us guys, when we could look like we were going to get home again after 2 years overseas. I suppose that's the biggest thing.
Were you on the USS Missouri when they signed it, or only?
No,
At the
I was in the hospital, and he was in there when they signed that, because he'd already stabbed himself, and then they brought it in there. But most all the signatures were on there from the boat. Yeah.
All his representatives.
Yeah.
And then he signed it in your presence.
He signed it in the presence there.
Who else was there?
It was a kid from Chicago.
Going to service knowing that you might be involved in a war?
Well, I wasn't too sure as to what I wanted to do. I thought about going to possibly to Wilson Junior College at the time, but not with any particular goal in mind. And I just was, you know, I just wasn't too sure. And I even though I felt that things were going to get worse, that even so, that I would rather be a part of something that interested me. And I looked at the different branches and felt that the Navy would be an interesting experience.
During the peace and war times of your Navy career?
Well,
Of course,
I was on two ships. USS Arkansas. And we have a guided missile cruiser now that's by that name, but the Arkansas I'm talking about was built in the World War I period and went through all of World War II, both Atlantic and Pacific. And I was on that ship that we had the North Atlantic duty. We, as I mentioned earlier before we started taping this, that I was already in the Navy before Pearl Harbor, and when Pearl Harbor, in fact, even before Pearl Harbor, we took a convoy up to Newfoundland on the eastern coast of Canada and back. And we went under completely blacked out conditions. So I don't know what happened at Pearl Harbor, but we were ready for trouble in the Atlantic. Completely blacked out, full cruise, no partial cruise, full cruise and everything like that.
Did you see any action in the Atlantic?
Convoy duty. We took the convoy up to Iceland after Pearl Harbor. Then we took a convoy to I want to say we had the destroyers dropping depth charges on possible submarine contacts.
You both said.
Yeah, right.
Why did you transfer over to the Pacific and you left the Arkansas?
Well, I was on the Arkansas not quite a year. It was an interesting experience, but being that it was an older ship, it was you were completely. I don't know how it got through the whole war. By that I mean you were always replacing switches. You had to always be making spare parts because some of the equipment was so old that you couldn't get.
They were getting
parts.
brittle, yeah.
And so we were just completely, we had torpedo blisters, which they don't have on the newer battleships. And every time we'd go out and fire our guns, which were 12-inch, it was the only battleship on active duty with 12-inch, because the other ships had 14 or new ones 16, we'd have to come back in and pump out those torpedo blisters because they would take on water. And I got tired of patching the patchwork, and I put in for new construction. Volunteered because they were always building new ships.
And you went over
and so I was accepted for the light cruiser, and
what was the name of the cruiser?
Birmingham, named after Birmingham, Alabama, and put that in commission in 1943, and back to the Atlantic we went because they were going to invade Sicily, and they needed all the ships that they could lay their hands on. And Sicily is the island that's off the southern tip of Italy in the Mediterranean. And went through that invasion. We were dive bombed by German dive bombers and things like that. And we used our guns against planes and against shore targets, like German tanks were coming down towards the beachhead to try and throw our forces off the beach. And we're sitting offshore firing 6-inch guns and picking off.
What ship was it, close calls you had on
What, in the Pacific. We were dive bombed in the Mediterranean but not hit. But in the Pacific, we were in part of the 3rd Fleet and the 5th Fleet as far as the carrier forces. But when we got out there, they decided to invade Bougainville because it was right next door to Guadalcanal. We missed the Guadalcanal invasion, but Bougainville had been bypassed, and it was so close that they were posing a problem with air attacks. They had hidden planes and all that business. So we were covering the invasion of Bougainville in the summer of '43 when we were hit. They're taping. We were hit by a skip bomb in the stern and a direct bomb hit on turret 4 and a aerial torpedo in the bow. And we laughed about it later, but we were hit in 3 places. So they ran up with the anyhow, we ran up the main deck repair ran up with electrical submersible pump and opened the hatch in the bow and went through it, lowered it, and wondered why they were losing suction. When they got lights down there, they found that the plates on the starboard side were ruptured, and on the port side there was a hole big enough that you could drive the Jeep through. So the pump could not work effectively because it's trying to pump out the ocean. So that was our first time. We had about 40 killed and wounded that time, and that was really very, very extremely low, considering we were hit in 3 places and still it had that small amount.
Was the next time the time you got injured?
Yeah, oh yeah, we had near misses in between. We were took part in the attacks on Wake Island, Tarawa, many of the other islands, the Caroline Islands, and we took part in the invasion of Sarpantini and Guam and Marianas, and we had near misses. But the next time when we were hit was invasion of the Philippines.
Pause for a second.
That was October 24th, 1944, so just a couple days ago. It was 39 years since that happened.
Almost 40.
But, yeah.
Coming up on 40.
And we were covering the invasion of the Philippines when the Japanese hit one of our carriers with one bomb.
What carrier was that?
That was the...
Forgive myself.
Yeah, I would draw...
A blank?
This is the Princeton. Princeton. There are Princeton carriers since that time, but this was a cruiser carrier built on a cruiser hull. Not the escort carriers, but a cruiser hull that had the same power plant that we had. And anyhow, it was hit by a bomb and set off a chain reaction among the planes that were fueled and loaded for the invasion of the Philippines. And we were fighting the fires on the carrier, and we broke away once because of aerial and sub contacts, and we're coming back in a second time to continue fighting the fire when it exploded. The rear magazines on the Princeton exploded.
You were on deck at that time?
Yeah, I was with a group about 7 or 8, and 1 minute we're talking, next minute we're flat on our backs, and 10,000 ton, well, with fuel and ammunition, I read later, it probably weighed about 12,500, but here the cruiser was just, the whole thing was just shaking from the concussions. And I fortunately did not hit the side of the shield around this lookout point, and so otherwise I would have been knocked unconscious and would have been bled to death. And then after a few moments I picked myself up, and everybody else was as still as anything. They were, I was in shock, but there was not anything, not any voice, nothing. And so then I climbed down the exterior ladders and down to the main deck, and on the watertight doors you have a wheel that you twirl and release the dogs, and I'd release it, step through, turn around, and close them. I went through each watertight door, I went through several, and opened and closed them, because that's ingrained in your watertight integrity. You don't leave doors open in battle to protect the ship. Closed all of them, went in the sick bay and sat down so they could take a look at me.
And how had you been injured?
Pardon?
How had you been injured?
Well, when the magazines blew up, it sent fragments of bombs and torpedoes and pieces of ship flying all over our ship. There's a picture in the Chicago Tribune 6 months later, which I have, and it showed the ship, and you could see all the superstructure, not the hull, but the superstructure above the main deck was just like a sieve, and punctured all in hundreds of different places. So what I was hit was pieces of metal.
A lot of shrapnel all through you.
Yeah, about a dozen different places, and I still have a piece up here, and I have a piece here. And a few years ago when I had a upper GI test, they told me in a civilian hospital that I had a piece of metal in my chest. So I was hit in about a dozen places and cut open on hands and arms, shoulder, and things like that. And, my fingers were banged up, but I didn't even lose a little finger. When they put me on a hospital ship, and then they flew me out to Pearl Harbor where they operated on me. and I was on the operating table about 4 or 5 hours. They gave me 3 pints of plasma on board the ship. And after I got the pearl, as part of the operation, they gave me 3 pints of whole blood.
That pretty well ended your military career?
Yeah, I never went down. I was in the hospital for 6 months, and I was scheduled for limited duty. I was here in Chicago at Navy Pier when Germany surrendered. And because I had a surplus of people, even though I was regular Navy and they could have held me for a couple more years, they gave me the option of staying in or accepting the discharge. They weren't going to hold me to the remaining 2 years, so I elected at that point, since I had enough of an experience to.
Well, you had over 4 years.
Oh yeah, I had 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. We never forget that. I mean the exact time in service.
So you were born in the 50s?
Yes.
And fairly early in it.
I guess so.
Do you remember any of the 50s?
Not really, except maybe later in the 60s. Later in the 50s, I do remember seeing some TV of President Eisenhower, which then quickly reverted to the 1960 primary with Nixon and Kennedy.
Huh. So you remember anything else from the 50s? What was your best memory of the 50s?
What was my best memory? What do you remember about the 50s?
Nice cars.
Personally. Lastly, about the 50s, what do you remember was happening in the world in the 50s?
In the world, well, we had the wars again, which were scary, the Cold Wars as they called them, and Korea, Vietnam, I believe, and those were scary to me because they brought back all the childhood memories of World War II. They didn't get in my family or in the world as big as World War II, but they were still quite frightening because of the nuclear threats, you know. And you're worried about having even your own children, bringing more, shall I bring more children into the world? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And my husband went in the service for a little while, and that scared me, but fortunately he didn't have to stay in long, so.
Okay.
Well, in the 50s, things were going very well for the family, and then I believe we had the outbreak, early 50s of Korea War started. And then again, the draft took effect. So there weren't too many people from our family that had to go, fortunately. But I remember a lot of my friends and their brothers and their uncles had to go to Korea, and that was another unhappy period of time. But also there was happy times for our family and for me, because as I entered high school.
What do you remember was happening in the world in the 50s?
Well, other than Korea, that pretty much was the biggest thing that I can recall from being an unhappiness, so to speak. Some good things were that our country was starting to prosper, and the automobile industry was booming, starting to boom then, as well as some of the other industries. So even though we had the Korean conflict going on, we had our country really was coming out of the dark days from the Depression and World War II, and we were really starting to really prosper as a country again, and a nation.
Okay.
Okay.
And,
So the family event in the 50s, right?
Yeah, and then that's when they were registering everybody for the draft. And I got registered again, because the first time I registered I was in 1948, and then I had to re-register in 50. And then the invasion from North Korea to South Korea was in June of 1950, and I didn't think nothing of it at the time, except by December they start drafting like crazy. They were drafting 80,000 a month, and I figured, well, it won't be long before I get called, and it wasn't. In December I got classified 1A, and in January, the end of January, they sent me an induction notice, and oh no, wait, it was the beginning of February that I got my induction notice. And I went into service the 24th of February, 1951. And I went down to Kentucky for training. And I spent 14 weeks training, infantry training. And I thought for sure I was going to Korea. And it just happened that the day, I figured, well, we're going to go to Korea, but it just happened a couple of months before that. They had sent 2 divisions over to Germany, and they were undermanned. So they needed replacements to fill them out. So that's when I got sent to Germany. And I was one happy guy, because everybody was going to Korea. There was very, very few. But then they start sending more to Germany because they were afraid of the Russians. And we were way undermanned in Germany. We couldn't have lasted 2 days against them with what we had there. So then I went there, and I enjoyed being in Germany, because nobody was shooting at me there. But going to Korea, that was all mountains, and everybody was being shot at there.
What else was happening in your family in the 50s?
Well, let's see, in the 50s. Well, everybody was having pretty good standard of living, and things were really good then. The economy was good in the earlier 50s. And then I got out of the service, and I just went back to work. And after I got out early 1953, and the Korean War ended in September of 1953. And then I guess something like 7,000 or 8,000 guys that had been held prisoner were released. And I remember reading that they said there was a lot more that had died in prison than that they didn't account for. So
Go ahead.
and when I got out, they were like when your Uncle Roy got out of the Army, they gave them guys a bonus, the state. When somebody brought up the bill about giving guys that were in the Korean War a bonus, but they voted that down, and they never brought it up again, so I never got that. But
going on in the world in the 50s?
I think it was when the Sputniks started, because I remember my dad would drive and he'd tell me to look out for the Sputniks. That's the only thing I can recall. I know I like to look. I remember when.
What do you remember about the 50s?
When he was a baby.
No, anything happening?
No, it was a very quiet year, 10 years. Nothing happened.
On a larger scale in the world going on that you remember?
Well, I remember the war, the Korean War was started in the 50s, wasn't it?
And was that significant to you, or?
Well, some of the friends that I had that were older than I think it was my sister's friends, went to the Army and the Navy at that time. I have vague memories of that.
Do you remember anything about the world in the 50s, 60s? Right?
60s.
That was interesting to you.
Oh, I remember the riots in Chicago. My ex-husband was a Chicago policeman. It was a time of turmoil. A presidential election, Kennedy being assassinated, I remember that vividly. Things of that nature.
the 60s?
Oh, a lot. 60s is where everything happened. I remember, of course, I remember vaguely the space program in the early 60s. Grissom being pulled out of the water. I remember, of course, the Kennedy assassination. I was home with my grandmother the day it happened. We were watching Boza Circus, and they interrupted it and told us horrible things were happening in Dallas. And the funeral, who could ever forget the 3 days of live television, the funeral and everything. And I remember the Beatles coming on Ed Sullivan. Well, I think I knew them better before Ed Sullivan. I think I had their poster in the hospital when I was sick, early in the 60s. The Vietnam War, of course, started I never knew about it until it took my brother in the draft and then sent them out there. And it became very important. And then all the protests, 1968, the incredible dual assassination of Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the riots, the convention, Chicago Convention riots, and then finally us orbiting the moon at the end of that year. That was a significant year. The landing on the moon. I guess I'm covering history as well as my own memory. My own memory too, of course, is of my dad's surgery.
Was in Vietnam. He was in the Army. And he served a year over in Vietnam, and he was almost killed. In one of their engagements, they were trapped by the Viet Cong, and only through sheer luck, some big tanks were nearby. There were 300 of the Americans, and they were surrounded by 3,000 Viet Cong. And these tanks came through and rescued them because the Viet Cong were going to kill them. And they thought they would get it done in an hour or two. But instead they fought back. And he was a medic, and he had to go out onto the wherever the engagement was, and he had to pick up the wounded and try to get them out of danger. And in that one engagement, he rescued about 34 people, and did it under constant fire. He was getting hit by bullets coming to the right of him and to the left of him. And for his bravery, he got a Bronze Star for bravery, which he never cared about, because when they came back from Vietnam, they were treated like criminals. They weren't even given any credit for what they did. Now, after about 15 or 20 years, I think it's 20 years, they're now starting to give them some of the credit they should have got when they first came back. And my youngest son...
Eisenhower was the president.
That's pretty good. What do you remember about the 60s? What's your best recollection of the 60s?
What happened in the 60s, I was...
What do you remember?
Becoming a little bit older. The Russians were coming, which they never came. Kennedy got elected. Of course, there was a whole bunch of other people that... I get the years mixed up. But Kennedy got elected, I do remember that. The Russians didn't come, and the missiles of October, the space program... Well, the beginning of the space program, Kennedy's assassination, not necessarily in the proper order, but hey.
So what was your favorite thing about the 60s?
What do you remember about the 60s?
Well, what I remember is a lot of great cartoons, when cartoons were real cartoons. I remember being interrupted by details like President Kennedy assassination, when they discontinued Garfield Goose. Pissed me off real bad. And I remember the Vietnam War. I remember, was that Woodstock, I believe, 69? A lot of President Nixon. I remember Kennedy. I think Nixon was in the 60s, right? No?
He was only vice president.
Oh, well, okay, all right.
Yes, he was in the 60s.
No, was it the 50s?
One year.
It was the 50s.
Okay.
1 year, yeah.
Okay, so I was pretty close.
Whatever.
And I remember grammar school, and the snowstorm of 64, and the snowstorm of 67, and the riots of 69, and that's pretty much covered. Turmoil in the 60s, actually. Eye-opening turmoil.
What do you remember, guys?
Riverview.
that's cool.
Definitely a river.
Whatever, I can't remember.
Okay, why did you like?
The happiest thing was
Let's go on Riverview for a minute. What did you like and remember about
the
Riverview?
Italian Bobs. I remember being scared to death. My father kind of persuaded me or almost forced me onto the roller coaster, and I loved him for it from then on. Because probably my favorite roller coaster in all life. I've never found one to be any better. Maybe it was the time, maybe it was the style, maybe it was just me, but I never found one better. It was a smooth, exciting ride rather than a rough, throw you around kind of ride. And the Riverview wasn't too far from the house, and all the lights, and activity. It was a real exciting place. I also did a lot of swimming.
What historically was happening in the world of the nation that you remember in the 60s?
Like I say, you know, they landed the moon, a man on the moon. I mean, you know, was that 50s or 60s? I forget what the hell date it was.
60,
but
69.
69, they landed the guy on moon there, but I figure, what are they going to discover up there? If discover more down in the ocean, where they got more resources and more wealth, you know, they gain more. But up in the sky there, they ain't going to get nothing up there. It's too damn far out. And other than that, it's about the same. I mean, I don't know, like I say, I don't remember.
What do you remember was the most memorable thing that was happening in the 60s? In the world.
In the world.
In the world.
Okay. Probably the death of President Kennedy. That was a few days after my daughter was born. Weeks, maybe a couple weeks after Renee was born. That just kind of blew me away. I didn't think that could ever happen again. I mean, you know, it had happened. I never thought anyone could get away with it in those days. You know, we were so modern then, you know.
Yeah.
But we weren't.
Anything else that happened in the world in the 60s?
We went to the moon, didn't we? I believe. And we were on a vacation, unfortunately, but I still remember it. We listened to it on the radio, and that was quite eventful. And of course, I've seen many pictures and movies of it, and that was very exciting. Never thought we'd do that.
Anything else happen in the 60s?
You trying to pry me for something that I can't remember?
Well, you remember Kennedy, you remember the moon.
Yeah.
There was also the war. I shouldn't lead the
Another war.
I shouldn't lead the witness.
To the war?
Yeah.
Oh, I said the wars.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll leave the 60s. What do you remember was going on in the world in the 60s?
I remember hearing about the President Kennedy being assassinated and shot.
I mean, you were very young then, huh?
I was very young.
Oh, that's...
Yeah, that's about all worldly. Probably, there was a lot going up with NASA, probably in the space program back then too. It always seems like there was astronauts in the news, but I don't remember too, just so young.
Okay, and that's all you remember? Well, don't remember the war? Or...
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't.
All right, you were lucky.
Yeah, I was. Pretty sheltered.
Yep. In the world in the 60s, anything?
Other than that, what we just talked
We
with the Kennedys and Oswald.
Yeah.
What the heck was it?
63.
I remember in the years, and then like you said, then Bobby, didn't he get killed too after Martin Luther King?
Right.
So there was the three of them as far as outstanding in the world.
Okay, we can move on to the 70s.
I guess an answer of my earliest memory would have to be, I guess it would be late 1963. I remember my mom bringing home my sister from the hospital. Not actually bringing her home, but she was a baby. And I remember coming up the basement stairs, and I remember that my mom was crying while she was ironing in the middle of the day. And I remember thinking, is the baby okay? So I went to the bassinet, the baby was fine. And I said, why are you crying? And she says, this is history. And she pointed to the TV, and I turned around, and it was John F. Kennedy's funeral procession with the horses and the coffin. And I guess that started my long history with history, because I do like history. Hippies, not that they were really popular then, but I remember my first grade teacher was allowed to bring her boyfriend into the classroom, and I marveled at the fact that he could come barefoot. And he sat there, and we played his guitar, and we sang songs. And I mean, that's my biggest memory of first grade, is that this long-haired hippie came in and played music into our first grade classroom. And that was my introduction into what was to be in the 60s. Second grade, which was a big year for me, because it started with the space program. And Mrs. Riley, my second grade teacher, was Eugene Cernan's sister, who's a famous astronaut, one of the last men to walk on the moon. And he came to visit our school. He showed us movies of the space, the moon, the earth, and I remember thinking, look at that. I said, you know, the earth was just so blue with these white billowy clouds, and the moon looked so dry, like a desert. And I remember that. Mrs. Riley was so proud of him, and that's probably, she introduced me into the space program. He came into Bellwood, where we lived, and did a parade. I think that was probably a little later in my life, but around the 60s. Third and fourth grade, what went on in history. I do remember Vietnam War was going on. I remember war was all over the place, TV. The guy across the street, who I believe was a distant relative on my dad's side, went to war. She hung the flag out in the window. And I honestly don't remember if he ever returned or not. But I do remember thinking how lonely she would be if he got killed, because she was all that he had, or she had. They lived alone, you know, together alone in the house. I remember at that time too the cars. He had a jacked up Mustang, I believe, which was a big car then. And the people next door to us, the Myers, George had started a band. He would play his drums, and I guess it started my love for music, because he would sit there and I would hear the drums, and I just loved the beat. And I'd be out in the backyard on my swing set, and I could hear. And I remember that. 60s were fun times. I saw my aunts at the house. They had a pool, learned how to swim. They were going through their own teenagehood with the war. I remember them contemplating, you know, the boys that they knew were going or might have to go. So I remember that. The famous moonwalk, of course, happened when we were on vacation one year in '69, because it was July. But I remember hearing about it. I remember thinking about it. I was far past second grade, but I always thought of Mrs. Riley and her famous brother.
The 60s.
Oh, well, the Russians were making all kinds of threats indirectly. They were always bragging about their missiles, and then when Kennedy ran for president, I remember I voted for him. And
One of the living Chicago voters as opposed to the dead.
yeah, yeah. And I remember when the Cuban Missile Crisis was, and I thought, oh God, no, not another war.
Oh, let's go back to the Kennedy vote. Why did you vote for Kennedy over Nixon?
Because he did, actually, he had a better way of projecting himself. Nixon would look terrible on TV. and he didn't project himself very good on TV. Where Kennedy was a shrewd speaker. He could, maybe he wasn't the greatest guy, but he was a shrewd speaker. He knew how to say what the people wanted to hear. And he was only in his early 40s. He attracted a lot of younger voters. So, and really, how good of a president he would have been, I don't know. He wasn't in there long enough for me to really judge it. But some of the things he did was good, though.
What else do you remember was going on in the world in the 60s?
Well, I remember when he started the Peace Corps, and that was, I don't know how effective it was, but it seemed like it was pretty good. And then we'd start, when the Russians first sent up Sputnik, and all that thing was what, about a size of a basketball and a transmitter in it. And right away everybody's looking to go out, and they tell you when it's going to go over, and you'd be going out there looking. And then we sent up like a balloon. It inflated when it got up in space, and it was, I forget how many feet across. You could actually see it. It would look real small, but you could actually see it moving across the sky at night. And then I remember we started getting involved in the astronaut program. And I remember when it seemed like it took them forever to launch one. They'd get it all ready to go up, and they'd have maybe 4, 5, 6 delays on some of them launches, because they really didn't know what they were doing. Everything was playing it by ear. And and I remember when they let's see, what was his name? The Navy guy. He was the first guy. He just went up and down.
Oh, Shepard.
Shepard, yeah, Alan Shepard. And then there was a couple more that they launched like that before Glenn really went on his. What did he make? 3 orbits? Yeah, he made 3 orbits. And you ever? I don't know if you've ever been to the museum and seen the capsule. Man, them guys had little or no room in that thing. And then I remember how the next step they advanced to was the Mercury.
Mercury was the first one.
Mercury was the first one. Gemini was the second one. And then how many launches they had on that. And then they had one where one of the astronauts, Smith was it, I think, was the first man to go out outside the capsule.
First American was Ed White.
White, yeah. And he didn't go very far. He was on like a tether. And then they kept advancing with more launches. And I remember when Grissom and White, was it White and who was the 3? Grissom, I remember, was one of the 3. When they had the fire and
Chappie.
And Chappie, yeah. And I remember that. And then they had the one where the first guy said they didn't land, they just went around the moon and came back.
Uh-huh.
And
that was on Christmas Eve at Grandma's house.
Yeah. I remember that.
I remember that very well.
You remember that?
Grandma's house, coming out after Grandma's party, and they were on the radio, and they just burned out of orbit, in fact, I think that night.
Yeah.
Right after the party.
Yeah, and then I remember when 1967, when we had that big snowstorm.
Right.
And I did have, I don't know what happened to them. I had movies of Susan and her sister walking through the gangway where the snow was higher than them. Because you couldn't, that was when we had 24 inches of snow in just a little over 20 hours or something like that. And nobody was going hardly anywhere except I rode for over a couple of months. I rode to work on the bus because I couldn't get my car out of the garage there. And but that was 60s were
Blizzard of '67 because I got out of school for a couple days. Let's see, I remember when Martin Luther King was shot and they were burning the city of Chicago because my dad was worried about his mom, who didn't live too far away from the area. So I remember him calling her and telling her to be careful.
Coming back again, and we were talking to Chris about the 60s, what was happening in the world in the 60s as she remembered it. Would you like to resume?
That's about all I can
Kennedy's
remember.
assassination, the Vietnam War, nothing else?
That's about all I can think of.
Okay, Kathy, what do you remember about the 60s in the world?
I remember John F. Kennedy that day when he got shot. I also remember the Vietnam War, but I also remember when they landed on the moon in '69. That was kind of a neat kind of experience. You know, I'll never forget. That was in the summer, July.
Did you get to see it?
'69. Yeah, watched it on TV. You know, watched him take that first step for mankind.
What was happening in the world?
Well, without sounding repetitious,
Sure,
Vietnam, Woodstock,
Woodstock. Wow, nobody's remembered that. Thank you.
all the great bands getting together and playing for, what was it, 3 days or something like that?
Did you remember when it was happening?
Yeah, I remember.
Oh, really?
I remember. Yeah, and that's, well, Kennedy, the fact that Kennedy was shot, that was a big thing a long time afterwards. That's about it.
Okay. The world in the 60s that you remember.
I was somewhat shielded from a lot of that, but I still knew that there were the hippies, there were drugs, and you know, the war, that you know, the Vietnam War. I remember seeing that on the TV, but again, I was somewhat shielded from all the violence. I do remember the Kennedys being shot, and Martin Luther King is a turbulent period, of course. But again, as a child, I was somewhat sheltered from it. But I wasn't in a coma. I remember that.
The 60s, it was a up and down period, if I could say it in the correct term, because there was so much negative going on politically, you know, in our country. The assassination of Kennedy, it just, our country, it took our whole country an enormous amount of time to get over that. Everybody felt an emptiness feeling, whether you were a Kennedy person or not. It was just terrible. And then to have the assassination of the assassinator take place in jail soon afterward, just compounded this entire terrible situation. That showing it every day, several times a day, as what happened, I just compounded this terrible feeling throughout our country. And from that standpoint, it was not an enjoyable period there because of that. I mean, there was some enjoyment because of my children and other good things happening in our family, having our first home, but this assassination of Kennedy and the results of that were just a terrible feeling for people of our country.
Well put. Any other historical things since we got out of the historical? What do you remember about the 70s?
The 70s, I guess becoming a teenager, well, close enough. Johnson ended in the 60s. Nixon finally became president after how many years? Vietnam, that was also part of the 60s, the beginning of Vietnam, but it was like, I didn't know that because I wasn't old enough to understand that until somewhere in the 70s.
When it became an important fact, I shouldn't influence you, but when you were almost drafted, right?
No, it was that I didn't know the beginning of Vietnam started in the 50s, carried on to the 60s, and prolonged into the 70s until it finally, I don't know, directly what's happening in the 70s that you remember.
Well, let's see. You have to keep hitting me with all this history stuff, huh? Thanks a lot. You're a real pal. All right, let's see. The history aspect of it. Well, the war stopped. Graduated high school. That was a historical moment.
What's happening in the 70s in the nation?
Oh, they avidly following the space program, Apollo 13, the last moon landing, the resignation of Nixon, the end of the Vietnam War, and the hostage crisis by the end of the war, by the end of the year, decade.
What do you remember?
What do you remember was happening to the world in the 70s?
To the world. Well, there was a lot of government problems that, you know, shake-up type stuff going on, and that was another thing that surprised me. Again, you think you're all American, you know, and I was probably learning everybody isn't perfect.
You know who you're talking about?
Well, I thought there were a lot of government issues going on, were there not? Am I wrong? Am I got the wrong
No, you
year,
got the
wrong
right decade.
decade?
I just
Nixon
wondered,
or
Nixon, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, Nixon's resignation.
Yeah, that sort of.
Okay, I guess that covers the 70s.
Really remembering what was going on then, that's when some of these prisoners were turned loose as prisoners of war. I know we had some fellows over there come back that'd been prisoners of war there. And one fellow, Lady Smith, I think he'd been a prisoner of war 7 years. At that time he had come back to a family in Lady Smith. You might say his family had already grown up then when he came back there. Probably a big thing there, I don't know. Other than that.
Through the 70s, like 73 to 75, I just remember Jimmy Carter's fireside chats. It was cold in the house. They wanted to conserve energy. It was, you know, that time. And he'd sit with a sweater, and he'd sit by the fireplace and do his fireside chats. 75, I do remember, or 73 we moved. I remember around that time, Vietnam War ending, the thing with Nixon, I may have this mixed up, but I remember him standing, giving his little peace signs, and my mom again with the This Is History, because I didn't want to watch it. She said, no, you should watch this is history. And so I did, I forced myself to see it. I remember the Vietnam vets, some of them that were released, and coming home, and the girl coming with her arms outstretched to see her dad, and how emotional that was. These are all TV things. Again, TV played a big part of my life. I don't remember a time without it. Music again, I love the music. My aunt and I used to go out, my sister too, sunbathe out in the backyard listening to Captain Tennille, Elton John, the Rolling Stones. You know, just listen to the radio and start to be a teenager, and that's what you did. In the 70s, I got my braces. Going into high school was a big time as far as the music element. Hard rock came into play. Disco was a big one in the later 70s, which I was too young to get into the clubs. So though some of my classmates did get in, Travolta and big movies, things like that. I guess the biggest thing I remember is that the Vietnam War ended, and it was I remember feeling at that time that, you know, not too long from then, kids that I know might be going, and I remember fearing that, although I was still young.
In the 70s.
Well, they were starting to have trouble in the different countries where like in Germany they had the well, I forget what it was, they wanted more right, they were having problems in East Germany where the people were wanting to get out of there, and they.
What do you remember was going on in the world in the 70s?
Ended the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War ended in the 70s.
Okay.
The gas shortage.
There was gas shortage. They were cutting back.
Kathy, you want to fill in on any other things that you remember from the 70s?
When the POWs came home from the Vietnam War, and
Okay.
the time when they were released from Vietnam, I remember that. And let's see, there was the hostage situation in Iran in '79. Yeah, I remember that. And the bicentennial in '76.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the bicentennial, which was kind of a neat thing. It was 200 years
Yeah.
that we were a country.
That's
So
right.
that was kind of a neat thing to be a part of.
Yeah, watch that TV. That was
Yeah.
very nice. How are you, Susan? Anything you'd like to either reiterate or add?
Well, they kind of summed it all up, but I remember in the bicentennial they had a bicentennial train museum, and I
Yeah.
remember going to see that. And
See, not everybody remembers everything. That's
Yeah.
I don't even remember that.
that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I remember that coming through. You're right.
I remember going there.
I think they had a copy of the, was it the Constitution or the Bill,
Or else they wrote you. remember.
Disco.
Disco, you remember that? Okay.
I remember going to see Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah, me too.
Playing the records and dancing in my bedroom.
Yeah.
And nobody could see me.
I remember going to a few discos too.
Oh, yes. I remember getting dressed and going to Stardust Bowling Alley. They had a disco there, and with my girlfriends, and we'd get all dressed up and go dance to the disco.
You remember what's going on in the world in the 70s?
In the 70s, as a teenager, I wasn't really as tuned into the news as much, but I do recall the problem in Iran where he had the hostages taken under Jimmy Carter's tenure as president. I remember the Grenada incident. I was worried because I was right about that age, and if we got in a war, you know, some of the guys my age were worried about getting drafted if they called that back in. And but of course the disco craze was a big thing then, and I took a greater interest in music at that time, so I remember a lot of the music from the 70s was really good.
Oh, what songs did you like of the disco?
Of disco? Casey.
Or did you?
Yeah, I did. I like, even to this day we have some disco CDs. I like all kinds of music. I like Casey and the Sunshine Band, some of Donna Summer's stuff. The Bee Gees were just okay, although they had a couple of really good ones. I wasn't a real big disco fan, but I did enjoy the music. I still prefer, you know, classic rock more, but I like that variety with the disco offers. So.
Yeah, I suppose we should go ahead.
What historically was happening in the nation or the world?
Let's see, Ronald Reagan got elected, but that was after the hostage crisis, not much else. Berlin Wall fell at the end of the decade, which I think is significant since we all lived under the fear that we'd be blown to bits. So the end of our Cold War, that was very significant.
What's happening in the world in the 80s?
Not much. Let's see, the 80s. Well, we always have had the threat of wars and with one country or another, okay? Trading problems, you know, with oil and gasoline and stuff like that. But I really specifically can't remember any big thing happening.
Okay.
One of the biggest things in March of '81 for me, personally, and why I remember it clear as a bell, again it deals with history, I was taking my Illinois State boards for dental hygiene to get my license. In this room, plus the teachers, we were monitored, we were secluded, even for lunch. And it was an 8-hour test that we took. And I remember the girls wanted to go out after this test was over to celebrate. So we went to a bar by the school, and it was my first news that Ronald Reagan had been shot as president, and one of his press secretaries or somebody else was shot. And I remember all I wanted to do was go home, because I felt, you know, for some reason, the history of it, that same feeling when John F. Kennedy was shot, and I just wanted to be home. So I left and went home and followed the progress, and thank God he was okay, but the secretary guy was not. And that was a big day. Early part of the 80s, I just getting settled into a crew. As far as history goes, I remember that when we got back from our honeymoon, or around the time of our honeymoon, which was November of '89, the Berlin Wall was knocked down, and that was a big thing between the German East and West and communism. And I guess I remember Gorbachev and things like that, but I don't remember exactly what went on, just names.
80s, and with Chris, is what do you remember was going on in the world in the 80s?
I think that's when they had those wars in the Middle East, and
No, that was the 90s.
I thought it was the 80s.
No, that was the 90s.
They started.
You got a better memory than all of us.
Yeah.
You can just talk.
Well, whatever you remember is okay. I don't want you to pass unless you just.
Yeah,
whatever
you
remember.
can go to Kathy.
Okay, Kathy. Let's go with your textbook memory of the 80s.
President Reagan got shot. Remember that? And Pope John Paul, I think he got shot either in the 70s or the 80s.
The 80s and a few
Yeah.
months from Reagan.
Yeah.
I have textbook memory too.
I remember that. Let's see what else happened in the 80s besides President Reagan. We had a black, what was that called, in the stock market? There was that Black Monday.
Yeah,
kind of a scare in '87.
Exactly.
Do you remember that?
Definitely a textbook.
Yeah. That's about nothing. Then the prep look was in for clothes. I remember that. The preppy look. That's about it.
And Susan, what can you add or reiterate about the 80s, historically?
Well, I remember Reagan being shot. That was big news. I can't really remember anything else historically.
Okay.
Free?
No problem. Okay, now we're going to move on to the 90s.
The
Challenger.
Oh,
Okay. And help from the outside, we have a Challenger disaster,
the
right?
Challenger exploded, and
This is, since you said that, I'll say the fall of the Berlin Wall, but we'll move on.
that's right.
We'll move on to the 90s.
That's right.
And what do you remember was happening in the world in the 80s?
Well, in the 80s, I wasn't real into politics, and I have never really been, but of course, you know, I remember President Reagan beating Jimmy Carter in the election and having being very popular president. I remember while I was at college his being shot by an attempted assassin, and he was able to survive that. A lot of my, how would you say?
So should we move on to history then?
History of the 90s, yeah, well, the Persian Gulf War, I guess, is the most historical thing of the decade, and that happened early. And other than that, let's see, the remainder of the 90s was, we've had a good economy after a bad recession in the early 90s. It's been so boring that we don't really care about the nature of our president in the 90s, and we're still happy with the way everything is because we have a great economy. And the final question on the 90s is, of course, what do you remember was happening in the world in the
One of the biggest events worldwide that I recall in the 90s is the Persian Gulf War. I remember, that was the first war that I experienced where I really was cognizant of the events leading up to the conflict, and then of course during the conflict, and I could better appreciate what the people involved were going through. Previous wars, I was a little too young and sheltered from that, but the Persian Gulf War was a big deal. I knew we would win. I was hoping we would win. I was hoping it wouldn't be another Vietnam, and I'm glad it went relatively glitch-free, and we did come out. I wish it would have had a long-term better ending, but overall, I think it's fair to say we won that one. Beyond that, of course, President Clinton came on the scene, and overall I think he's done a good job. Of course, the Monica Lewinsky scandal was another big thing in the 90s. I don't think we'll all forget that very soon. It's too bad it happened, but I'm hoping that the next president will set a better example.
And that's it for the 90s?
Yeah.
Up the 90s, anything you remember that was going on in the world in the 90s? Anything that you
Well,
thought was significant?
the Chicago Bulls championships are very, very important and a big part of all our lives.
Forgot all about that.
And this Clinton situation is just too bad because of some of his personal life tragedies that have taken place. He probably could have gone down as one of the most successful presidents that we've ever had this not happened. But fortunately, the people that he's had in office to run the country from an economic and government standpoint have done a good job. I just hope that we continue to have peace and prosperity in our nation. I think we sit well as we go into the new millennium as still a major power in the world, and I don't like to use the term power, but I mean if that's what the term that is used throughout the world, then so be it. But we're here to take care of ourselves first, as far as our country, and then help the other unfortunate nations. I think that we sit in a good position to carry it forward.
Okay. On the world in the 90s.
Would have been nice if you made a list and I could pick one of them out.
Well, if you can't remember, it's okay.
I don't remember what the heck ever happened.
Okay.
I know there's been a lot of heartbreak where there's been planes that went down, Oklahoma with the bombing. I think that there's a lot of happy things that have happened, but there's also been a lot of tragedies that I don't think that, even up to today, that you wonder how people survive all of that, and planes going down. I think this is all the big things, because it's such a monstrosity of people that are getting killed. It isn't one or two. It's, there's planes around here, a couple, 2, 3 go down, but there's hundreds that go down in the other. And that's from all over the U.S. where people are leaving. So I think that's the big thing.
Question about the 90s is what was happening in the world in the 90s?
Well, of course, we were back in a few scrimmages at Kiwat deal, and a couple other little scrimmages there, but other than that,
91, we did get pregnant. But we lost the baby. During the war of Iraq. And don't know if that had anything to do with it, the stress. But it was a major thing for us. And took some time to recover. Into 96, well, we have President Bill Clinton as president. Economy became better. I remember Tom changed jobs.
Oh, well, all the communism was falling apart, which made a lot of people happy, me included. And then we got involved in the early 90s, we got involved in the Gulf War there. And that's when we finally got to see the stealth plane that they kept such a secret for a long time.
Anything else happening in the 90s? And so now we come to the last question about the 90s, and actually the last question about the decades. Chris, what would you say you remember was going on in the world in the 90s?